A police officer rips off an elderly black woman's hearing aid, but everything changes when he learns her son is the mayor of the city. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The morning sun filtered through the worn curtains in Mabel Jenkins' modest living room, casting soft golden light over her collection of cherished photographs. Framed pictures of her late husband, her young son Jason, and various milestones lined the shelves. Each photo told a story, a moment frozen in time, a reminder of a life filled with quiet resilience and unspoken hardships. Mabel rose from her bed slowly, her knees aching from years of wear and tear. She sighed, gripping the edge of the mattress for support before shuffling to the kitchen. The small house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking of a clock on the wall. For Mabel, this solitude was both a comfort and a burden. She had lived alone for over a decade since her husband passed, and though her son Jason visited occasionally, his growing responsibilities as the city's mayor had made his visits rare and brief. She turned on the kettle and opened the cupboard to retrieve her favorite tea tin. The kettle's whistle broke the silence, and she poured the hot water over the tea leaves, watching as they swirled and steeped. The aroma of chamomile filled the room, a small comfort in her daily routine. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, and glanced at the calendar. Another quiet day stretched ahead of her, marked only by her weekly trip to the local grocery store. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Mabel often thought about how different it felt now compared to when she first moved here with her husband. The streets that once felt warm and inviting now seemed indifferent, filled with strangers rushing past each other without so much as a nod. The small businesses she once frequented were gone, replaced by chain stores and trendy cafes that catered to a younger, wealthier crowd. The community she had known was a distant memory. Mabel adjusted her hearing aids, feeling the familiar weight behind her ears. They were her lifeline to the world, allowing her to hear the sounds she had taken for granted in her youth. The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, the laughter of children playing in the distance. Without them, she felt disconnected, adrift in a sea of muffled noise. She dressed in her usual attire, a simple floral dress and a cardigan, paired with comfortable shoes that had seen better days. Grabbing her shopping list and reusable bag, she stepped out into the crisp morning air. The street was already bustling with activity. Cars honked in the distance, and a group of teenagers laughed loudly as they passed by on their bicycles. Mabel took a deep breath, steadying herself before beginning her walk to the store. The route was familiar, lined with a mix of old and new buildings. She passed by the church where she used to attend services with her husband, now mostly empty except for the occasional wedding or funeral. The sight of it brought a pang of nostalgia, and she found herself lost in memories of Sunday mornings spent singing hymns and chatting with neighbors. As she continued, she encountered a few familiar faces. Mrs. Carter, her longtime neighbor, waved from her front porch. "Mornin', Mabel," she called out, her voice warm and inviting. "Mornin', Clara," Mabel replied with a small smile. The brief exchange brightened her mood, reminding her that there were still pieces of her old community left, even if they were few and far between. Further down the street, Mabel passed a group of young mothers gathered outside a coffee shop. They were engrossed in conversation, their strollers lined up neatly along the sidewalk. Mabel couldn't help but notice how different their lives seemed from her own experience as a mother. They spoke with confidence and ease, their laughter filling the air. Mabel thought of Jason and how hard she had worked to give him a better life, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort and dreams. The grocery store came into view, a modern building with automatic sliding doors. Inside, the aisles were brightly lit and neatly organized. Mabel took her time, carefully selecting each item on her list. She was mindful of her budget, comparing prices and choosing only what was necessary. As she reached for a can of soup on the top shelf, a young man in a store uniform approached. "Need some help, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite but detached. "Oh, thank you," Mabel replied, stepping aside to let him retrieve the can. She appreciated the gesture, but couldn't shake the feeling of being treated as fragile, as if her age defined her capabilities. With her shopping complete, Mabel made her way to the checkout line. The cashier, a cheerful young woman with brightly colored nails, greeted her with a smile. "Did you find everything okay?" "Yes, thank you," Mabel said, her voice soft but steady. She paid for her groceries and packed them into her bag, grateful for the small act of kindness. As she stepped outside, the sun was higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city. Mabel adjusted her bag on her shoulder and began the walk back home. The streets were busier now, filled with people rushing to and from their destinations. She moved at her own pace, pausing occasionally to rest and take in her surroundings. Halfway home, she noticed a police officer standing on the corner, his arms crossed as he surveyed the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern expression that made Mabel uneasy. She avoided eye contact, quickening her steps as she passed by. The officer glanced in her direction but said nothing, his gaze lingering just long enough to make her feel uncomfortable. The encounter left Mabel unsettled, a faint shadow over what had otherwise been an uneventful morning. She couldn't explain why the sight of the officer bothered her so much, but it stirred a deep-seated unease that she hadn't felt in years. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the familiar comfort of her home just a few blocks away. By the time she reached her front door, Mabel was tired but relieved to be back. She set her bag on the kitchen counter and sat down with a sigh, taking a moment to collect herself. The house was quiet again, the ticking clock marking the passing seconds. Mabel sipped a glass of water, her mind drifting to Jason. She wondered if he would call today or if another week would pass in silence. As the afternoon stretched on, Mabel couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events were a prelude to something more. The world outside her door felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't quite place. But for now, she found solace in the stillness of her home, unaware of the storm that was about to upend her quiet existence. The soft light of late afternoon began to fade as Mabel Jenkins rested in her small kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound accompanying her thoughts, which drifted back to the police officer she had encountered earlier. There was something unsettling about his gaze, something that lingered in her mind longer than she cared to admit. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling as paranoia, and decided to occupy herself by putting away her groceries. One by one, Mabel placed the cans, bread, and vegetables into their designated spots in her cupboards and refrigerator. Her fingers moved methodically, but her mind remained restless. The officer's presence stirred memories she had tried to bury. Memories of other encounters, of moments when her existence was questioned, her integrity doubted, simply because of the color of her skin. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The streets outside grew busier as the evening approached. Mabel's window overlooked the neighborhood park, where children played on swings and dogs chased after sticks thrown by their owners. The familiar sounds of laughter and barking reached her, mingling with the faint hum of car engines. These were the moments she loved most about her home, small, ordinary moments of life carrying on. But peace was fleeting. She glanced at the clock and realized she had forgotten to pick up her prescription from the pharmacy. It wasn't far, just a short walk past the park, but she hesitated. The earlier encounter had shaken her confidence, and the idea of stepping back outside filled her with unease. Yet she reminded herself that this was her neighborhood, her home, and she had every right to walk freely within it. Mabel grabbed her coat and scarf, slipping them on before stepping out into the crisp evening air. The streets were bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. She walked slowly, her steps measured, her senses heightened. As she neared the park, the sounds of children playing faded, replaced by the occasional bark of a dog and the distant murmur of passing cars. Her route took her along the edge of the park, where the path was lined with tall trees whose bare branches swayed gently in the breeze. It was a peaceful scene, but Mabel's heart quickened when she spotted the same police officer from earlier. He stood near the entrance of the park, his hands resting on his belt, his eyes scanning the area. Mabel hesitated for a moment, considering taking a different route, but she dismissed the thought. Changing her path would feel like admitting fear, and she refused to give him that power. She kept walking, keeping her gaze forward, her pace steady. The officer noticed her. His eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see right through her. She gripped her bag tighter, willing herself to remain calm, but as she drew closer, he stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharp, "can I have a word with you?" Mabel froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease building inside her. "There's been a report of theft in the area," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. "I'm going to need to check your bag." Mabel's heart sank. She looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might intervene. But the path was empty, and the few people in the park seemed oblivious to what was happening. She clutched her bag tighter. "I haven't stolen anything," she said firmly. "These are my groceries." The officer's lips curled into a smirk, a look of condescension that sent a chill down her spine. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me taking a look." Reluctantly, Mabel handed over her bag, her hands trembling. The officer dumped its contents onto the ground, sending cans and vegetables rolling across the pavement. He bent down, sifting through the items with exaggerated thoroughness. "Looks like you're clear," he said after a moment, standing up and dusting off his hands. But instead of handing the bag back to her, he reached for the small plastic case containing her hearing aids. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. "They're my hearing aids," Mabel said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "I need them." "They look expensive," he remarked, turning the case over in his hands. "You sure you didn't lift these from somewhere?" The accusation struck like a blow. Mabel's face flushed with indignation. "Of course not," she exclaimed. "I've had those for years. They're mine." The officer chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made her blood boil. "Relax, ma'am. Just doing my job." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the case onto the ground. It landed with a crack, and Mabel gasped, rushing to pick it up. One of the hearing aids had popped open, its delicate inner components exposed. Tears stung her eyes as she knelt on the pavement, gathering her belongings. She wanted to scream, to demand an apology, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. The officer watched her for a moment before turning and walking away, his boots crunching against the gravel. As he disappeared from view, Mabel remained crouched on the ground, her hands trembling as she tried to fit the hearing aid back together. Her vision blurred with tears, and her chest ached with a mix of humiliation and rage. How could this happen? How could someone sworn to protect and serve treat her with such disdain? A voice broke through her haze of despair. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She looked up to see a young man standing a few feet away, his phone in hand. He had been recording the interaction, she realized, though she hadn't noticed him before. His face was filled with concern. "I'm fine," Mabel said quickly, brushing away her tears. "I just need to get home." "Do you want me to help you?" the man asked, stepping closer. "I saw everything. That officer was way out of line." "No," she said, her voice firm. "Thank you, but I'll manage." The young man hesitated, clearly unsure whether to insist. But Mabel gathered her belongings, stood up, and began walking away before he could say anything further. Her pride wouldn't allow her to accept help, not after what had just happened. As she walked home, the broken hearing aid clutched tightly in her hand. Mabel's mind raced. The humiliation she had just endured was all too familiar, a painful reminder of the injustices she had faced throughout her life. But this time there was a witness. Someone had seen. Someone had recorded, and for the first time she wondered if she should let the world see what had happened. By the time she reached her house, the sun had set, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Mabel entered her home, locking the door behind her. She set the damaged hearing aid on the kitchen table and sat down, staring at it as though it held the answers to the questions swirling in her mind. The anger she had suppressed on the walk home began to rise, filling her chest with a fiery determination she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't over. Mabel sat in her small kitchen as the events of the evening replayed in her mind. The indignity she had suffered at the hands of the officer, the cruel way he had mocked her and shattered her hearing aid, lingered like a bruise that refused to fade. She cradled the damaged device in her hands, staring at it as if willing it to repair itself. Her emotions fluctuated between humiliation, anger, and a deep sense of exhaustion. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the muffled sounds of the neighborhood filtered in. Cars passing by, distant laughter, the hum of evening life. Yet the stillness inside her home was oppressive, amplifying the weight of her thoughts. She wanted to call Jason, her son, but an all too familiar hesitation stopped her. Their relationship had grown distant over the years, and she didn't want to burden him with her troubles. Unbeknownst to Mabel, the young man who had witnessed the incident had already taken action. His name was Eric, a college student and aspiring journalist with a passion for exposing injustice. He had uploaded the video to his social media accounts with a caption that read, "Elderly woman harassed by police officer. When will this stop?" Within hours, the video began to spread. At first, it garnered a few comments and shares from Eric's friends and followers, but soon it caught the attention of a local activist group. They reshared the post, adding their own caption, "This is why we need accountability in law enforcement. Watch and share." The video's views skyrocketed, attracting attention from people across the city and beyond. By morning, Mabel's face and the officer's actions were plastered across social media feeds, sparking outrage and debate. People commented furiously, with some expressing sympathy and anger, while others questioned the context or sought to defend the officer. The incident became a lightning rod for discussions about racial profiling, abuse of power, and the treatment of vulnerable citizens. Mabel woke up early the next day, unaware of the growing storm. She followed her usual morning routine, brewing a pot of tea, tidying the kitchen, and flipping through her worn photo album. As she glanced at a picture of Jason as a boy, she smiled faintly, remembering how fiercely he had defended her as a child. It was a bittersweet memory, tinged with regret over how their relationship had changed since he became mayor. Across town, Jason Jenkins was sitting in his office at City Hall when one of his aides burst in. "Mr. Mayor," the aide said breathlessly, holding up a tablet, "you need to see this." Jason raised an eyebrow, setting down the policy proposal he had been reviewing. "What's so urgent, Sarah?" The aide handed him the tablet, and as Jason pressed play, his expression hardened. The video showed his mother standing on the path by the park, her groceries scattered on the ground as the officer rifled through her belongings. The moment he grabbed her hearing aid and tossed it carelessly was like a punch to Jason's gut. "That's my mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes widened. "Oh my God, I didn't realize." Jason set the tablet down and ran a hand over his face. "How bad is it?" "It's everywhere," Sarah admitted. "The video's gone viral. Activist groups are demanding action. The police department is already getting calls from reporters." Jason leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His first instinct was to call his mother, to check on her and make sure she was okay. But he knew this was bigger than a personal matter. As mayor, his response would set the tone for how the city handled such incidents. Yet, as a son, the sight of his mother being humiliated and mistreated filled him with a quiet fury. "I need to make a statement," Jason said after a moment. "Draft something for me. Something measured but firm. We'll call for an investigation into the officer's conduct." Sarah hesitated. "With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, some of your advisors think it might be better to distance yourself from this." "The police union," Jason cut her off with a sharp look. "That's my mother in that video. I'm not distancing myself." Sarah nodded, leaving the room to prepare the statement. Alone in his office, Jason stared out the window, his thoughts drifting back to his childhood. He remembered the sacrifices his mother had made to give him a better life, working long hours, enduring indignities she never spoke of, always shielding him from the worst of it. And now, despite everything, she was still enduring. Mabel, meanwhile, had started receiving phone calls. Her landline rang incessantly, with numbers she didn't recognize flashing on the caller ID. At first, she ignored them, assuming they were telemarketers. But when the calls persisted, she finally answered. "Hello? Mrs. Jenkins, this is Lisa Thomas from Channel 7 News. We'd like to interview you about the incident with the police officer. Can we schedule a time to—" Mabel hung up, her heart pounding. She stared at the phone, her mind reeling. How did they know? How did anyone know? A knock at her door startled her. Peeking through the window, she saw Eric, the young man from the park, holding his phone in one hand and a coffee in the other. She hesitated, but eventually opened the door. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you," Eric began, his voice earnest. "I just wanted to check on you, and, well, the video I posted went viral." Mabel blinked, confused. "What video?" Eric shifted awkwardly. "The one from last night. I recorded what happened with that officer. I thought people needed to see it." "You recorded me?" she asked, her voice tinged with both surprise and disbelief. "Yes, ma'am," Eric admitted. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but I couldn't just let that go. People are talking about it now. Your story. They're on your side." Mabel didn't know what to say. She felt exposed, as if the private pain she had experienced was now on display for the world to dissect. Yet, a part of her was grateful that someone had borne witness to the injustice. "I don't want trouble," she said finally. "I just want to live my life in peace." "I understand," Eric said gently. "But sometimes the only way to get peace is to stand up and demand it." Mabel closed the door softly after Eric left, her thoughts swirling. The world outside her quiet home was changing rapidly, and she found herself caught in a storm she hadn't asked for. But as the hours passed and the phone continued to ring, she realized that she couldn't ignore it forever. Meanwhile, Jason's statement was released to the press. It was carefully worded, calling for accountability and promising a thorough investigation into the officer's actions. Yet, it stopped short of acknowledging his personal connection to the incident. While many praised his swift response, others criticized him for not being more forceful. The city was divided. Protests began to form outside the police department, with activists demanding justice not only for Mabel, but for others who had suffered similar treatment. The video had become a catalyst, igniting conversations about systemic racism and police reform. As night fell, Mabel sat by her window, watching the faint glow of streetlights. The world felt larger and more chaotic than it had the day before, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But deep down, a spark of determination began to grow. She thought of Jason, of the values she had instilled in him, and of the resilience she had carried throughout her life. The world was watching now, and maybe, just maybe, it was time for her voice to be heard. The city's hum buzzed faintly in the background as Mabel sat by her window, her thoughts still tangled in the chaos of the past day. Her small home felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a spotlight under which the world was watching. The phone calls had finally stopped after she disconnected the line, but the weight of what had transpired refused to lift. The video, the officer, the young man with the camera, all of it played in an endless loop in her mind. Outside, the faint sound of chanting reached her ears. Mabel leaned closer to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Down the street, a small group of people held signs, their voices rising together in protest. Though she couldn't make out the words, the determination in their voices was clear. They weren't just angry. They were calling for change. Mabel sighed and turned away, retreating into her living room. She felt caught between worlds, between the quiet life she had worked so hard to maintain and the storm of attention that now surrounded her. She had never asked to become a symbol for anything, and the weight of it felt both alien and overwhelming. The knock at the door startled her. She froze, her heart racing. For a moment, she thought it might be reporters again, or perhaps another well-meaning stranger looking to offer support. But when she peered through the peephole, her breath caught. Standing on the porch was Jason. She hesitated before unlocking the door, her hand trembling slightly. When she finally opened it, her son's face was a mixture of exhaustion and concern. He wore a tailored suit, his tie slightly loosened, and his expression softened the moment he saw her. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. Mabel stepped aside to let him in, her emotions swirling. She hadn't seen Jason in months, their last conversation reduced to brief pleasantries during a hurried phone call. Now he stood in her doorway, looking every bit the polished politician he had become, but with an uncharacteristic vulnerability in his eyes. "You didn't have to come all the way here," Mabel said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and a hint of reproach. "I did," Jason replied firmly. "I saw the video." Mabel's lips pressed into a thin line as she led him into the living room. Jason sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Mabel took her usual spot in the armchair, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with years of unspoken words and the weight of their strained relationship. "I'm sorry," Jason began, his voice breaking the tension, "for what happened to you, and for not being here sooner." Mabel studied him carefully. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, but there was also something else, a flicker of guilt, of hesitation. "You've been busy," she said, her tone even. "I know your job keeps you occupied." Jason shook his head. "That's not an excuse. I should have called more, visited more, especially after Dad passed. He stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I thought I was doing the right thing by focusing on my career, but watching that video, seeing what you went through, it made me realize how much I've been neglecting you." Mabel's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to tell him it was okay, that she understood, but the truth was more complicated. She had always been proud of Jason's success, but it had come at a cost. Their once close bond had frayed, leaving her feeling like an afterthought in his busy life. "I'm fine, Jason," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "I've dealt with worse." "That doesn't make it right," Jason said sharply. "What that officer did, what he said to you, it was unacceptable. And it's not just about you, Mom. This is happening to people all over the city. It's systemic." Mabel's gaze softened as she looked at her son. His passion reminded her of the boy she had raised, the one who used to defend her so fiercely on the playground when other kids teased him for his clothes or his lunch. But she could also see the weight he carried now, the responsibility he felt not just as her son, but as the mayor. "Do you really think you can change the system?" she asked quietly. "It's been this way for so long." Jason leaned back against the couch, his expression contemplative. "I have to try, but I can't do it alone. People need to see what's happening, to understand it. That video, it's already started a conversation, but I need your help to keep it going." Mabel stiffened slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying people want to hear your story," Jason explained. "You have a chance to make a real difference, Mom, to show the world what it's like, what so many people go through every day. If you're willing, I can arrange for you to speak at a press conference, or even just give a statement." Mabel shook her head, the idea overwhelming her. "I'm not some activist, Jason. I've lived my life trying to avoid trouble, not stir it up." "This isn't about stirring up trouble," Jason countered. "It's about standing up for yourself, for others like you. You've always been strong, Mom, stronger than anyone I know. But you don't have to do this alone. I'll be there with you." His words hung in the air, and for a moment Mabel didn't respond. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the photos of her family, the reminders of the life she had built through quiet perseverance. She thought about the young man who had recorded the video, about the protesters she had seen outside. They were fighting for something, and whether she wanted to admit it or not, she was now a part of that fight. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. Jason nodded, sensing that pushing her further would only backfire. "That's all I can ask." They spent the next hour talking, not about the video or the protests, but about simpler things. Jason asked about her garden, her health, the neighbors she still spoke to. It was the kind of conversation they hadn't had in years, and for a brief moment it felt as though the distance between them was beginning to close. When Jason finally left, Mabel walked him to the door. He turned to her before stepping outside. "Whatever you decide, Mom, I'm proud of you. Always." As she watched him walk down the street, Mabel felt a mixture of emotions. Pride in her son, gratitude for his support, and a lingering sense of uncertainty about the path ahead. The world outside her door was changing, and for the first time in years, she wondered if she could find her place in it once more. She closed the door and returned to her armchair, her thoughts heavy. The video had thrust her into a spotlight she hadn't sought, and Jason's words had planted a seed of doubt in her resolve to stay silent. As the night stretched on, she stared at the damaged hearing aid on the table, a symbol of both her vulnerability and her strength. Change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not, and deep down, Mabel knew she had a choice to make. Mabel's home felt quieter than ever after Jason left. His visit had stirred something in her, a combination of pride, frustration, and the faint flicker of a long-dormant fire. She had spent decades navigating a world that often tried to push her aside, choosing silence over confrontation, peace over chaos. But the events of the past days had shaken her sense of safety. The memory of the officer's sneer, the careless way he had treated her, was burned into her mind. And now her son was asking her to step into a spotlight she had spent her life avoiding. Outside, the city was stirring with energy. The protests that had started as small gatherings were growing larger, their chants and signs louder and bolder. Mabel could hear them even from her living room. She closed her eyes, trying to tune out the noise, but the words kept echoing in her mind. Justice for Mabel Jenkins. End police brutality. No more silence. Her phone buzzed on the table. After Jason's visit, she had reconnected the line, bracing herself for more calls. The number flashing on the screen wasn't familiar, but she answered anyway. "Mrs. Jenkins?" a woman's voice said, calm but firm. "This is Angela Carter. I'm with the Community Alliance for Justice. We're organizing efforts to push for police reform in the city, and your story has become a central part of the conversation." "I didn't mean for it to," Mabel said quietly. "I'm just a woman trying to live my life." "And that's exactly why your story matters," Angela replied. "What happened to you isn't just about you. It's about all of us. People are listening now. They want change, but they need someone to lead them. Will you consider speaking at one of our rallies?" Mabel hesitated, her thoughts flashing back to Jason's words the night before. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," she said. "I've never been one for crowds or speeches." "You don't have to be a professional speaker," Angela said gently. "You just have to be honest. Tell them what happened. Let them see the strength you've shown in the face of injustice. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. You have more support than you realize." When the call ended, Mabel sat in silence for a long time. The idea of standing before a crowd, bearing her pain and vulnerability for the world to see, was terrifying. Yet, a small part of her wondered if Angela was right. Perhaps her story could make a difference. Across town, Jason was already knee-deep in the political fallout of the viral video. His statement to the press had sparked mixed reactions. While some applauded his commitment to justice, others accused him of pandering or undermining the police force. At a tense meeting in City Hall, Jason faced a room filled with divided opinions. "Mr. Mayor," one councilman said, his tone sharp, "your decision to publicly criticize the police has created a lot of tension. The union is threatening to stage a walkout if disciplinary action is taken against Officer Grayson." Jason's jaw tightened. "And what do you suggest we do? Ignore what happened? Pretend it didn't happen just because it's inconvenient?" "I'm suggesting we approach this carefully, the councilman replied. "The police force is the backbone of this city. If we alienate them, they alienated themselves when they allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked," Jason interrupted. His voice was calm but firm. "We can't build trust with the community if we refuse to hold our officers accountable." The room fell silent. Jason scanned the faces of his colleagues, searching for even a glimmer of agreement. Some avoided his gaze, others looked openly skeptical. He knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but he had no intention of backing down. Meanwhile, protests continued to grow. Angela Carter and her organization worked tirelessly to organize peaceful demonstrations, drawing support from activists, local leaders, and everyday citizens. The park where the incident had occurred became a gathering point, its paths lined with candles and posters bearing messages of solidarity. Mabel watched the coverage on the evening news, her emotions a mix of awe and unease. Seeing so many people rallying around her story was both humbling and overwhelming. She felt a pang of guilt for wanting to retreat into her quiet life, knowing that others were fighting so hard for her. One evening, Angela came to visit Mabel in person. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, but her voice was warm as she sat across from Mabel in the small living room. "I know this is a lot to take in," Angela said, "but you're at the heart of something bigger than any of us. This city is waking up, and it's because of you." "I don't feel like a leader," Mabel admitted. "I'm just trying to get through each day." "Leaders don't always choose their roles," Angela said with a small smile. "Sometimes the role chooses them. You don't have to be perfect, Mabel. You just have to be brave." Angela's words stayed with Mabel long after she left. That night, as Mabel sat by her window, she found herself thinking about all the times she had stayed silent, all the moments when she had swallowed her pride to avoid confrontation. She thought about the young man who had recorded the video, about Jason's plea for her to share her story, and about Angela's unwavering belief in her. The next morning, Mabel made her decision. At the next rally in the park, Mabel stood on a makeshift stage, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone. The crowd stretched out before her, a sea of faces filled with expectation. Jason stood nearby, his expression a mix of pride and nervousness. Angela gave her an encouraging nod. Mabel took a deep breath and began to speak. "I never wanted to be here," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I never wanted to be the center of attention. But what happened to me isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about the way we're treated, the way we're seen, and the way we're dismissed." She paused, scanning the crowd. "For too long, I've stayed quiet. I thought that if I just kept my head down and stayed out of trouble, I could avoid the worst of it. But staying quiet doesn't change anything. It doesn't stop the injustice. It just lets it continue." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy fueling her courage. "So, I'm here to tell my story," Mabel continued, "not because I want to, but because I have to. Because if we don't stand up for ourselves, no one else will." Her speech was short, but it was powerful. By the time she finished, the crowd was chanting her name. Jason stepped forward, wrapping an arm around her shoulder, his pride evident in his smile. For the first time in years, Mabel felt a sense of purpose, a sense that her voice mattered. The war against the system was just beginning, but Mabel was ready to fight. The energy of the rally lingered in Mabel's mind long after she returned home. For the first time in her life, she had stood before a crowd and spoken her truth. She had felt their cheers, their solidarity, and for a brief moment, she believed change was possible. Yet, as the adrenaline faded, doubt crept in. Would her words make a difference? Could her voice, shaken and hesitant, truly stand against a system so vast and unyielding? Mabel sat in her living room, the faint hum of the television in the background. The evening news was replaying clips from the rally, her own face appearing on the screen. It felt surreal to see herself there, her words quoted and dissected by commentators. Some praised her courage, calling her a symbol of resilience, while others questioned whether the movement was exploiting her for their own agenda. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. She reached for it, expecting another journalist or supporter, but the voice on the other end was familiar. "Mom, it's me," Jason said, his tone warm but weary. "I saw your speech. You were amazing." Mabel smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "I wasn't sure I could do it," she admitted. "But the people there, they gave me strength." "They weren't the only ones inspired," Jason said. "The city's talking about you, Mom, about what you've done." Mabel's smile faltered. "Not all of it is good," she said softly. "I've seen the comments, Jason. Some people think I'm just stirring up trouble." Jason hesitated. "That's to be expected. Change always makes people uncomfortable. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the future of this city. And you've given people a reason to believe that change is possible." Mabel appreciated his words, but the weight of her newfound role pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had always been a private person, content to live her life quietly. Now her face was on every screen, her name on every tongue. It was both empowering and terrifying. Across town, Jason was fighting his own battles. His public support of his mother and the movement had drawn sharp criticism from the police union and certain factions of the city council. In private meetings, he faced opposition that was both subtle and overt. At one such meeting, Jason sat across from Chief Nolan, the head of the city's police department. The chief was a grizzled veteran, his demeanor stoic and unyielding. He had been one of Jason's early allies, but the recent events had strained their relationship. "You're putting me in a difficult position, Jason," Nolan said, his voice low but firm. "The men and women of this department are feeling betrayed. They think you've turned your back on them." Jason met his gaze without flinching. "I haven't turned my back on anyone, Chief, but I won't ignore what happened to my mother, or the broader issues it represents." Nolan leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "Do you really think you can fix this by throwing one officer under the bus? Grayson made a mistake, but he's not the whole department." "It's not just about Grayson," Jason said evenly. "It's about accountability. If we don't address these issues head-on, we'll never rebuild trust with the community." Nolan's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mayor. The union won't take this line down. They're already talking about a walkout. You push them too far, and you'll lose the very people you need to enforce the laws in this city." Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't waver. If they're not willing to hold themselves to a higher standard, then maybe they're not the right people for the job. The tension in the room was palpable. Nolan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're making enemies, Jason. I hope you know what you're doing." As the chief left, Jason exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was determined to stay the course. His mother's courage had shown him that the fight was worth it, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson was becoming increasingly volatile. Suspended from duty pending the investigation, he spent his days stewing in anger and resentment. He saw himself as the victim, unfairly targeted by a system that had turned against him. In his mind, He was the scapegoat for problems that went far beyond his actions. Grayson's frustration boiled over one evening when he appeared on a local talk show, invited to share his side of the story. Sitting across from the host, he presented himself as a hard-working officer who had been unfairly vilified. "I've spent my entire career serving this city," he said, his voice calm but edged with bitterness. "And now, because of one incident, I'm being treated like a criminal. That woman—" He stopped himself, taking a deep breath. "Mrs. Jenkins has every right to feel upset, but this has gone too far. I was just doing my job." The host pressed him. "But what about the video? The way you handled her belongings, the things you said, don't you think that crossed a line?" Grayson's jaw tightened. "Videos don't tell the whole story. They're just snapshots. I didn't intend to cause harm, but in this climate everything gets blown out of proportion." The interview sparked outrage, with many accusing Grayson of deflecting responsibility. Yet, it also galvanized his supporters, who saw him as a victim of cancel culture and political overreach. The city grew more divided, the lines between justice and loyalty blurring. For Mabel, the growing tension was both empowering and unsettling. She continued to attend rallies and meetings, her presence lending strength to the movement. Yet, she also felt the weight of the opposition, both overt criticism and subtle threats. One evening, as she returned home from a community meeting, she found an anonymous note slipped under her door. It read, "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." The threat shook her, but it also steeled her resolve. She called Jason that night, her voice calm but determined. "They're trying to scare me," she said, "but I won't let them win." Jason's voice was filled with both pride and concern. "You don't have to do this alone, Mom. I'm here for you." "I know," Mabel said, "but this isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been afraid to speak up. If I don't stand my ground now, what was all this for?" The next morning, Mabel joined Angela and other activists at a press conference. She stood at the podium, her hands steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "I've spent my life trying to avoid trouble," she said, her voice strong, "but staying quiet hasn't kept me safe. It hasn't stopped the injustices. It's only allowed them to continue." Her words resonated, drawing both applause and renewed determination from the crowd. Yet, the fight was far from over. The police union announced plans for a citywide protest, accusing the administration of unfairly targeting law enforcement. Jason faced mounting pressure from all sides, his allies dwindling as the stakes grew higher. As the city teetered on the edge of chaos, Mabel and Jason stood firm, their bond strengthening in the face of adversity. The road ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. The fight for justice was worth every sacrifice. The days following the press conference were a blur of activity. Mabel found herself at the center of a movement she had never planned to join. She attended meetings with activists, spoke at rallies, and even participated in late-night strategy sessions. The quiet life she had known for decades was gone, replaced by a whirlwind of speeches, interviews, and public appearances. And yet, amidst the chaos, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Jason, too, was in constant motion. The pressure from all sides was unrelenting. The police union's protest loomed, and members of the city council were calling for him to back down, accusing him of undermining the city's law enforcement. Yet, Jason remained steadfast. He had seen too much: his mother's courage, the community's pain, the systemic flaws that had festered for years. Retreat was not an option. One evening, Jason called Mabel from his office. His voice was tired but resolute. "Mom, the investigation into Grayson is wrapping up. The findings are damning. They've uncovered a pattern of misconduct, excessive force, racial profiling, even complaints from other officers. I'm holding a press conference tomorrow to announce his arrest." Mabel was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" she asked softly. "One officer. It feels like a drop in the ocean." "It's a start," Jason replied, "and it's more than just about Grayson. The reforms we're proposing, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, stricter accountability measures, they're the real goal. But none of it will matter if we don't take this first step." Mabel nodded, though he couldn't see her. "You're doing the right thing, Jason. I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," Jason said, his voice softening. "That means more than you know." The next day, the city was electric with anticipation. News outlets gathered outside City Hall, their cameras trained on the podium where Jason would speak. Protesters and supporters filled the streets, their voices mingling in a cacophony of chants and shouts. The tension was palpable, a city on the brink of transformation. Mabel watched from the crowd, standing beside Angela and a group of activists. She felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety as she waited for Jason to take the stage. The stakes were high, and she knew the backlash would be fierce, but she also knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that could shape the future of the city. When Jason stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent. He looked out over the sea of faces, his expression calm but determined. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered into microphones, and the city held its breath. "Good afternoon," Jason began, his voice steady. "Today, I'm here to speak not just as your mayor, but as a member of this community, a community that deserves justice, accountability, and trust. For too long, we've turned a blind eye to the issues within our police department. For too long, we've allowed a culture of silence and impunity to persist. That ends now." He paused, letting his words sink in. "After a thorough investigation, it has been determined that Officer Grayson's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a pattern of misconduct that has undermined the trust of the community and tarnished the reputation of our police force. Effective immediately, Officer Grayson is under arrest and will face charges for his actions." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices ringing out across the plaza. Mabel felt a swell of emotion as she joined in, her hands clapping together with a vigor she hadn't felt in years. Yet, amidst the celebration, she noticed pockets of dissent. Police officers standing stiffly, their faces tight with anger, and protesters shouting accusations of betrayal. Jason raised his hand, calling for silence. "This is not about vilifying our police force," he said. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who serve and protect do so with honor and integrity. And it's about rebuilding the trust that has been broken." He went on to outline the reforms his administration would implement. Independent oversight boards to review complaints against officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and the establishment of a community advisory panel to foster dialogue between the police and the neighborhoods they served. As Jason spoke, Mabel felt a sense of hope she hadn't dared to embrace before. His words were not just promises, they were a blueprint for change, a path toward a better future. And for the first time, she believed that future was within reach. The press conference ended, but the work was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the city became a battleground of ideas and emotions. The police union launched a campaign against the reforms, calling them an overreach that would hinder officers' ability to do their jobs. Supporters of the movement pushed back, organizing rallies and town hall meetings to build momentum for change. Mabel continued to play an active role, her voice becoming a powerful symbol of resilience and determination. She spoke at events, met with community leaders, and even sat down with young activists to share her story. Each time, she felt the weight of her words, the responsibility of representing not just herself, but countless others who had suffered in silence. One evening, as Mabel prepared for bed, she received an unexpected call from Jason. His voice was filled with a quiet pride. "Mom, I wanted to tell you before the news breaks. Grayson pled guilty today. He's accepted a deal that includes prison time and an agreement to testify about systemic issues within the department." Mabel sat down, her hand gripping the phone tightly. That's incredible, Jason. I didn't think it would happen so soon." "It's a step," Jason said. "There's still so much to do, but this feels like progress." Mabel smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You've done something amazing, Jason. Your father would be so proud of you." Jason's voice softened. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You showed me what it means to stand up for what's right." As they said their goodbyes, Mabel felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she no longer felt alone. The city was changing, and she had played a part in that change. The following weekend, a celebration was held in the park where it all began. The atmosphere was jubilant, with music, food, and speeches from community leaders. Jason and Mabel stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. As the crowd cheered, Mabel felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had supported her, for the progress they had made, and for the hope that the fight for justice would continue. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm golden light over the park, Mabel looked around at the faces of those who had gathered. They were young and old, black and white, united in their determination to build a better future. And in that moment, she knew that her voice had made a difference. The war wasn't over, but they had won a battle. And for Mabel Jenkins, that was enough to keep fighting. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more stories like this one. Share this video with friends and family to keep the conversation going. And check out our other videos for more powerful narratives and thought-provoking tales. See you in the next one.